In Daniel chapter 4, the watchers in heaven make the decision that Nebuchadnezzar should be reduced from the status of a man to the status of a beast. And this language becomes paradigmatic in the book of Revelation for how the Antichrist is discussed, the one who takes Christians to their deaths. And so we want to read Daniel chapter 4 on its own terms, try to understand what this book meant for the original audience, but we also want to read it with one eye looking ahead to the book of Revelation and to the way that it will incorporate this Danielic imagery and language. I, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. Before we move any further, we have an interesting situation to deal with. Namely, this doxology where Nebuchadnezzar gives all this glory to God, this is a part of what story? Right? Is this at the beginning of chapter 4 as we have it in our English Bibles? Is this the beginning of the story where Nebuchadnezzar gets humbled to the status of a beast? Or does this belong at the end of chapter 3? Because in Hebrew Bibles, modern editions of the Hebrew Bibles, you'll open it up, and this doxology is not the beginning of chapter 4, it's the ending of chapter 3. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego are rescued from the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar promotes them, and then as the ending of that story, he gives this doxology praising God. But our English Bibles are different. Our English Bibles put it at the beginning of chapter 4. Hebrew Bibles put it at the end of chapter 3. And now this is interesting. Why is this? Well, manuscript evidence from antiquity supports the understanding that this doxology is to be placed at the beginning of Daniel 4 rather than at the end of Daniel chapter 3. Now, how did it get moved over to chapter 3 in our editions of the Hebrew Bible? As Lucas explains, the chapter divisions in modern editions of the Hebrew Bible go back to the medieval chapter divisions of the Latin Vulgate. Now, that was the Bible that was in Latin that became standard in the Middle Ages for the Roman Catholic Church. And these chapter divisions are generally attributed to Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in the early part of the 13th century. These divisions were adopted in manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in the 14th century. The decision to put these verses at the end of chapter 3 may be influenced by the fact that these types of doxologies, where you give praise to God, this is not usually how a story begins. This is usually how one ends. And so Stephen Langton, he's reading Daniel, and he says, you know, this doxology, this might be better at the end of chapter 3. That may be the better understanding. And so he moves it there in his chapter divisions because he's used to finding doxologies at the ending of stories, not at the beginning of stories. And so beginning, in the 12th, 13th centuries, people begin to understand that this is the end of chapter 3, not the beginning of chapter 4. So how did it get switched? I mean, even though Hebrew Bibles still keep this at the end of chapter 3, your English Bible and many other languages, they're going to put it at the beginning of chapter 4. When did the switch back take place? At the time of the Protestant Reformation, both Luther and Calvin recognized the inappropriateness of the chapter divisions in this case. And so Luther altered it in his German translation of the Bible. And now English translations have done the same thing. And so even though a modern printing of the Hebrew Bible is still going to keep this in chapter 3, ever since the Protestant Reformation, it got moved back to chapter 4. And Roman Catholic scholars like John Collins, they accept that this is the correct way to do things. As Collins says, this division was rightly rejected by Luther and Calvin, but has been retained in modern editions of the Hebrew Bible. And so in antiquity, it was with chapter 4. In the Middle Ages, it got switched back to chapter 3. Again, if you read Hebrew, your modern printings of the Hebrew Bible are still going to place it at the end of chapter 3. But since the Protestant Reformation, The Reformers recognized it belonged with chapter 4, and modern scholarship, including Roman Catholic scholarship, has accepted that it does belong at the beginning of chapter 4. And so this is just interesting how this little bit of Daniel had a tendency to get moved around throughout Daniel's reception history. Sharon Pace points out that while ancient Jews considered this to be with chapter 4 the way it is in our modern English Bibles, not with chapter 3 the way it is in our modern Hebrew Bibles, she does point out that one rabbinic source, however, does consider that these words form the ending to the previous count of the 3 youths in the fiery furnace. Because of his cruelty, Nebuchadnezzar himself was burned by the flames as he sentenced his exiles to such a fate. Only because of God's mercy did he survive. We read, quote, "Whence do we know that Nebuchadnezzar became half burnt?" Rabbi Isaac said, "From the fact that he said with his own mouth, 'It hath seemed good unto me to declare the signs and wonders that God Most High hath wrought toward me,'" quote, that is, on my own person. And so he read this part where he says, you know, I want to tell you what God has done to me or toward me. And he just thought this made better sense in relationship to the fiery furnace. That is, if you supply the feature that Nebuchadnezzar was burnt by the fire. Obviously, the text doesn't say this, but if you've been following this study throughout, we've consulted the rabbis many times, and we've seen that they are not at all limited to the text. They're very imaginative, and they feel a certain license to, see features and narrative details in the storyline that a modern Christian person would not necessarily place there. And so it's interesting that most Jews understood it as being part of chapter 4, but you do have an exception here with Rabbi Isaac. Nebuchadnezzar says, "To show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me," or that could be translated, "done to me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders." Now, the reference to signs and wonders here recalls Israel's redemption at the time of the Exodus, as God explains to Moses, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders," that's our key phrase, "in the land of Egypt. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them." Again, Pace makes an interesting comment. She points out that it's ironic that Nebuchadnezzar's own words allow the reader to compare him to Pharaoh. Just as Pharaoh's cruelty and arrogance are vanquished by God, so too will Nebuchadnezzar be humbled. We have seen that Daniel, the character, is to be interpreted in light of Israel's biblical traditions, that he is a sort of a new Joseph, anointed man in captivity who can interpret dreams and guide God's people through in the time of their trial. Well, how are we to see Nebuchadnezzar vis-a-vis the older biblical traditions? Well, we are to compare him to Pharaoh as a harsh taskmaster who keeps God's people in their vanquished state, but all of this is merely a precursor to God vanquishing him in a new type of Exodus experience. Now let's read the story of Nebuchadnezzar being reduced to the status of a beast. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. And at last Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, Chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it, and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, and you, O Belshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation. O king, it is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. In verse 8, it says that Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belshazzar after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of, could be a spirit of the holy gods, could be translated a spirit of the holy God, could be translated a holy divine spirit. So which one is it? Golden Gay says that Nebuchadnezzar's pagan faith has just been referred to here. That is, he just said that he was named after his god, Belteshazzar. And expressions such as this are not used to the true God elsewhere in Daniel. And so Golden Gay is going to say, hey, this is not a reference to the Spirit of God. This is not the Holy Spirit. Nebuchadnezzar's eyeballs are the ones that we're looking through here, and he sees Daniel as being empowered by his own gods. But this could be a sophisticated double entendre, that the reader is supposed to understand one thing while Nebuchadnezzar understands another. Nebuchadnezzar thinks that we are here talking about a spirit of the gods, but the reader knows that the spirit in Daniel is not of the gods, but of the one true God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar is what? Nebuchadnezzar is a tree, verse 20. The tree you saw is you, O king. He is a human being. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and you shall be driven from among men. He is reduced to a beast, and let a beast's mind be given to him. So we need to be on guard of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar is sort of a shifting metaphor here. Sometimes he's a tree, sometimes he's a human being, and sometimes he's a beast. And the language might shift all at once, and we may not get much of a warning. And so we just have to be on our feet about that, because as we're going to see in a moment, there are places where the imagery might shift pretty abruptly, or it might even get kind of mixed together. Now, this is just an aspect of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic does this. In apocalyptic, a symbol might share a referent with another symbol. Right? You might have 2 symbols that point to the same thing, or you might have one symbol that points to 2 different things. Here's an example from Revelation 17. The 7 heads of the beast are 7 hills. right? And in 1710, it says they are also 7 kings. So you have one symbol that points to 2 different things. In Revelation 12, the church is both the woman and the remnant of her seed. So the woman represents the church in its spiritual purity. It's the new Eve. It cannot be defiled. But the remnant of her seed represents the church in its physical vulnerability. It is vulnerable to the violence of its enemies. Those of you who did my videos on Revelation, you should understand this very well. And so I'm just saying, watch out for this in apocalyptic. Your metaphors shift pretty quickly. A guy might be a tree in one passage, he might be a man in another, and a beast in another. This is just part of the flexibility of apocalyptic. This is just how it goes. Nebuchadnezzar and his pride take a fall, but does the writer intend for us to compare his fall to that of Adam? In verse 25, it says, "He shall be driven from among men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you." Well, remember that when Adam falls, he is told that he would eat the plants of the field. And this probably implies a contrast with the previous situation of free access to the fruit trees of the garden. Right? He no longer has that free access, and so he has to go and eat the plants of the field, just as Nebuchadnezzar is being told to do here as well. Now, that's a very small and tentative connection, but it's interesting that there may be more of a connection after we consider Jewish interpretations of the Adam story. The Palestinian Targums are these paraphrase translations that are expanded and meant to comment upon the original text. So think of how we have the Message Bible, the Living Bible. These are paraphrased versions that not only translate, but they explain and even add some content to help illuminate the text. Well, the ancient Jews had those as well. And the Targums in Genesis 3:18 believe that human dignity and distinction from the animals is on the line when it comes to Adam's fall. Adam says, "O Lord, let me not be considered like the animals to eat the grass of the open field. Let me rather stand up and work, and let me eat food from the work of my hands. And thus let there be a distinction before you between human beings and the animals." And so after you compare the story of Nebuchadnezzar to how at least some Jews were interpreting the Adam story, they begin to look very similar here. Adam was told to reign over the animals and was given access to the tree of life, but then he was reduced to eating food from the field like the animals instead of from the garden. Nebuchadnezzar was over the animals and was a great cosmic tree, but he is reduced to eating from the field like the animals. His fall is hard, just like that of Adam, and I think the echo here of the Adam story is intentional. After the tree representing Nebuchadnezzar is cut down, it says, "Leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze." Now, why would this make any sense? Why would you cut down a tree and wrap the stump in a band of iron and bronze? Some have suggested maybe the band is meant to keep the tree from splitting or keep it from branching, as though metaphorically speaking, if branches come off of it, it represents the perpetuation of Nebuchadnezzar's line for many years to come, and that's being prevented by wrapping it with bronze. These are all fine and good as far as speculations go, but we don't know of this practice in ancient arboriculture. If we had some sort of a historical reference, if we knew of somebody in the ancient world doing this to a tree after they cut it down, then maybe this could work. But as it stands, we don't have any point of reference for this in the ancient milieu. Mixture of tree and beast imagery. We talked about this a moment ago, how the text can shift between Nebuchadnezzar being a man, being a beast, being a tree without any sort of a warning. It just kind of happens automatically. Goldingay says, restraint by a metal ring is part of an animal-like existence. So maybe we're not supposed to picture a stump being wrapped with a band of iron. Maybe we should picture a beast wearing a collar, something to that effect. Now, Jerome said that Nebuchadnezzar was being restrained as though a madman. Obviously, a madman and the animal imagery are not altogether incompatible. Now, the Old Greek sees it the same way. The imprisonment was a matter of being bound by them with bronze fetters and manacles. These are devices of restraint that you place on a prisoner whom you've taken captive. And so that is likely what we're dealing with here. He is an animalistic madman who's been restrained with a band of iron, it is not likely that the tree imagery alone can account for this, because it doesn't really make sense to wrap the stump of a tree with a bronze band. A reader who is primed by his knowledge of the New Testament may recognize a semblance of language between the parable of the mustard seed and the language that is used here of Nebuchadnezzar. In Daniel 4:12, speaking of the tree that represents Nebuchadnezzar, it says its leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Jesus, in reference to his kingdom, said, "What is the kingdom of God like, and to what shall I compare it? It is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his garden, and it grew and became a tree, and the birds of the air made nests in its branches." Now, why would Jesus echo this story? It's likely to forge a contrast between the temporal element of his kingdom and that of kingdoms like Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar represents a political kingdom, and all political kingdoms are temporary. They're here today and gone tomorrow. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, like Jesus, does provide shade and it does provide sustenance. The difference is Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is cut down the way all kingdoms ultimately get cut down. But the kingdom of Jesus is different. It's eternal. Its king is just. It does truly provide rest and sustenance. And it's not only for a little while, it's for all eternity. Many readers have tried to make inferences about the relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar based on their conversations together in the book, and many readers have been made uncomfortable by how close Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar seem to be. In verse 19, Belteshazzar answered and said, "My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies." He seems to be on Nebuchadnezzar's side when he says this. Verse 27, "Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may be perhaps a lengthening of your prosperity." Now, Jewish interpreters were especially hostile toward Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. As Newsom says, some Jews asked if Daniel was culpable for aiding an idolatrous blasphemer. If Daniel had given Nebuchadnezzar poor advice, could he have hastened the demise of the oppressive empire? So they're reading this and they're saying, look, Daniel is trying to tell this guy how to get in the good with God, and thus how to perpetuate his empire for even longer. Why would Daniel do that? Has he betrayed the Jews in favor of Nebuchadnezzar? Newsom continues, for his disloyalty, some rabbinic interpreters claimed God allowed the conquering Persians to demote Daniel to a mere court attendant, where he met and served Esther as her eunuch. Others suggested Daniel's trip to the lion's den was punishment for his collaboration with Nebuchadnezzar. So again, we are surprised. We've seen this in previous lessons, how harsh the rabbis could be on Daniel, a harshness that does not show up in Christian interpretations of Daniel. And so this is very interesting, and it just shows that the Jews would develop an animosity toward Nebuchadnezzar that the author of Daniel may not have held, or at least he may not have held so openly as the following slides will suggest. Pace believes that there is a strong anti-Nebuchadnezzar bias here, and that Daniel is in fact against Nebuchadnezzar, but he has to be very subtle in his subversive language against Nebuchadnezzar. He uses these sorts of very sophisticated double entendres here. May it be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies, are wisely chosen words, as they may have different meanings for Nebuchadnezzar and for the reader of the entire account. So Nebuchadnezzar hears it one way, you as a reader are supposed to hear it another way. As Nebuchadnezzar would hear it, the sentence could be understood positively, implying that anything unfortunate in the dream should occur for those who oppose him or his regime. But for the reader of the entire account, Daniel's words may be read as a suggestion of Nebuchadnezzar's downfall and the advent of the next kingdom. All right, so may it be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. Well, Nebuchadnezzar hears Daniel as saying, these bad things in this story, hopefully they don't happen to me. Hopefully they happen to my enemies. And it's fine that Nebuchadnezzar hears it that way. Daniel set it up that way. However, you as a reader are supposed to know that that's not what Daniel means. Daniel means, may this dream that declares the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar, may this be for the benefit of your enemies, people like Daniel, people like the Jews, other people who have suffered under the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So there are two levels of meaning here. There's what Nebuchadnezzar hears, and then there's what the reader is supposed to hear. And in John's Gospel, you can see this take place a number of times. Think of when Caiaphas says that it would be better for one man to die than for the entire nation to perish. There are two levels of meaning there. There's a kind of a double entendre. There's what Caiaphas intends to say to his audience. He's intending to say, look, Jesus is a rebel. He gets all sorts of negative attention for the Romans. It'd be better for us to kill him than for him to continue to provoke the Romans until they drop the hammer down upon our nation, and we all suffer. But John says that Caiaphas was speaking prophetically. And what John is intending for his audience to understand is that the statement, it would be better for a man to die than for the whole nation to perish, that this is a statement on the atonement, that it'd be better for Jesus to die for our sins than for us to perish for our own sins. Two levels of meaning there. There's what Caiaphas intended, and then what John says is prophetically being spoken through Caiaphas. Right? Two levels of the story. That sort of thing may very well be taking place here. This is if that's the case, then this is a very sophisticated text. We know that John does that. Does Daniel do that? Pace thinks so. Again, Pace is going to suggest that the text is subversive because Nebuchadnezzar gives his own description of the dream, but Daniel gives his description of the dream, and it's one where Daniel does not speak of Nebuchadnezzar's tree in nearly as much glorified language as Nebuchadnezzar does. Nebuchadnezzar states that the tree is in the center of the world. Well, Daniel does not repeat that. Nebuchadnezzar also tells us how high the tree is. Well, Daniel only abbreviates that very much. He doesn't seem to be impressed by the metaphorical height of the Babylonian Empire. Now, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he says that the tree provided shade for all living things. It sounds very pastoral. The tree sounds very beneficent. But Daniel changes the language. He merely states that everything lived under the tree. Right? The tree is not nearly as personal and warm in Daniel's telling of it. Also, Nebuchadnezzar says that all living things were fed from the tree, but Daniel simply says that there is food in the tree for all. And Pace suggests that this looks forward to a statement that's coming up later. It looks like when Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar he needs to repent, one of the things he needs to repent of is not taking care of the poor. Now, if that's how that phrase is supposed to be read, and we'll talk about that later, then this makes sense here. Nebuchadnezzar sees his kingdom as feeding everybody. Daniel simply sees the tree as having the ability to feed everybody, but it's not doing so. The tree is not just. The tree is not providing enough food for everybody, even though it could. Now, this is a very subtle reading, and not everyone is going to agree with Pace, but Pace says compare the way Nebuchadnezzar discusses the tree and compare the way Daniel discusses the tree, and Daniel's description is not nearly as grandiose as that of Nebuchadnezzar. You likely noticed in a previous slide that there is some artwork on here of Nebuchadnezzar as a ghost figure. He's an animal wandering around, but he looks like a ghost. Well, this comes from Arthur Boyd, and in the period of the American War in Vietnam, he was an objector against America's involvement in Vietnam. He thought it was an unjust war, and in order to caricature and denounce the American government, he personified them as being a type of Nebuchadnezzar, a proud tyrant wandering around as an animal, but he turned Nebuchadnezzar into a ghost. This sort of a death phantom is how he saw American leadership at the time. So it's very interesting the way that Daniel chapter 4 ended up having a location in American history at the time of the Vietnam War. A final aspect to be noted on the conversation between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel has to be very careful about the things he's going to say. He omits the following phrases that were used previously in Nebuchadnezzar's version of the watcher's words. All right, we've already talked about the tree. Now we're talking about the watcher who comes down in the dreams. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let the mind of an animal be given to him. Daniel doesn't repeat that because it's potentially offensive. The Most High sits over the kingdom of mortals, the lowliest of human beings. Daniel, of course, is not going to repeat this, that he thinks Nebuchadnezzar is the lowliest of human beings. By not repeating such devastating images, the author suggests that Daniel must continue to speak cautiously while yet indicating what the future holds for Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel's not compromising. He tells Nebuchadnezzar what the dream means, but you can just kind of see that he's very careful about the way he tiptoes around certain aspects of the language. Why get killed by Nebuchadnezzar if that isn't necessarily something he needs to accomplish in order to accomplish delivering the message? You can see here a rendition of the scene in the book of Revelation in chapter 4, where the throne is surrounded by the 24 elders. And these elders represent Yahweh's divine council, a ruling body in heaven that God uses to rule over the cosmos and to determine the fate of nations and political rulers and who knows what else. Now, that's most likely who the Watchers are. These are members of the heavenly council who pass judgment on Nebuchadnezzar. Now, some viewers of this video may not be familiar with this teaching, that God has a council of heavenly beings that he uses to rule over the cosmos, and so I want to share a few texts with you. Psalm 89. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones. That's who these holy ones are. They're the members of the heavenly council. This is also the term for saints that you find in the New Testament. That's what the Bible is calling us when it calls us saints. It's saying that in Christ our destiny is to be members of the heavenly council, and awesome above all who are around him. Job 15:8, have you listened in the counsel of God, and do you limit wisdom to yourself? Revelation 4:4, around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. They have crowns on their heads because they are kings who make government decisions in Yahweh's cosmos. Probably the best picture of this comes from 1 Kings chapter 22. And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go and do so. Now notice this. This spirit is evil. It's going to do something dishonest. And Yahweh gives him the thumbs up. He says, go do this. Now this is our first hint, not necessarily our first hint, but one of our major hints that there are these spirits in the heavenly realm who have a job from Yahweh, and they are fallen, they are evil, and despite the fact they are fallen and evil, they are not yet punished. They are allowed to continue in their vocations. God gives them a job, they figure out how they're going to do it. This one chooses to lie, and because he is a fallen spirit, but nevertheless, he is still employed in the heavenly council. You see this here as well in Psalm 82. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Now, this gods here is a word Elohim, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're gods in the same way that Yahweh is a god. It just means that they're beings from the divine realm. That's another question for another time, but it doesn't mean that they're gods in the polytheistic sense. And God speaks to these beings in the divine council, and he says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and the destitute. So these beings who rule over the nations of the world, they are supposed to do justice, and they are not doing justice. You kind of see this in that passage in 1 Kings. Yeah, he's going to do what Yahweh says. He's going to find a way to entice the king to die at Ramoth Gilead, but he's going to lie in order to do so. Well, here in Psalm 82, we find that the members of this council are still doing evil things, But they will eventually pay for it. Verse 6, I said, you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like any one of the princes. He's not talking to a council of men on earth here. That's why he says, you will die like men. Well, the reason that's significant is because he's not talking to men. He's talking to heavenly beings, angels, who otherwise would not die. But they will because of the wicked way that they've ruled over the nations. And so this goes back to Deuteronomy 32, where at the time of the Tower of Babel, as punishment, the nations of the world were placed under the guardianship of these angels as part of the divine council. And we'll discuss this at much more length when we get to Daniel chapter 10.